Okay, we're back. We're live for the 1 o'clock show here on a given Thursday. This is ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm Jay Fidell. More specifically, this is our series called Global Connections. And we have Carlos Juarez joining us from Puebla, Mexico. And we're going to talk today about the future of the Republican Party, a momentous, inquiry right now. Welcome to the show, Carlos.
Welcome, Jay. Always a great pleasure to connect and reconnect. And, while we are global connections, and I come to you at the moment from Mexico, I have to remind you and our listeners, I'm an American, born and raised in the U.S., all my education, but also I'm a political scientist, a political science professor. And so much of the time I'm teaching about politics, international politics, but also American politics. And of course, the U.S. as a global power, the world is watching and observing. And as we have for our topic today, try to talk a little bit about what is the future of the Republican Party, because like so many ththings, there's a lot of uncertainty. And if we've learned anything in this Trump era, it's like good luck predicting the future. That doesn't stop us from thinking about it or, envisioning some scenarios. And, from time to time, we're called to ask about that. But let me make very clear, we don't know. I mean, there are obviously different paths, different possibilities. But what we do know is that the big gorilla, the big elephant in the room is still there. Donald Trump today remains, in some ways the key, one of the key powers. And we're watching this interesting dynamic, right? The struggle about, whether they're going to soul search or whether they're going to split. Is it going to, find a path out to moderation, or is it going to become somehow more radicalized? Or is it going to collapse? Is the Republican Party going to die? And
I have a question for you, Carlos. He's the big kahuna in the room. But why? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if it was up to me, I wouldn't pay any attention at all to him. And yet somehow he commands the attention of the media, of the Republican Party and 70 million plus people. What is it about him?
Yeah, it is a puzzle, but maybe just to reinforce that, I mean, the fact is, in many ways, it's remarkable that somebody who you would think would be divorced from the party now, and the party has moved on, the base, the so-called base, the core supporters of the Republican Party and of the president remain very much still there. And so the most recent polling show us that 82% of Republicans still approve of Mr. Trump, 64%, a majority of Republicans still believe he won the election. That's quite astonishing. I mean, it's not a minority. A majority of the Republicans still believe that. And similar numbers even believe that they would join a new party if he were to start one, a so-called Patriot Party. Well, that sounds good and interesting, but one of the things to quickly mention is, why does the U.S. not have a third party, or why is it difficult for third parties? And the quick short answer is that the electoral system makes it very hard. In effect, we have what's known as a single member winner-take-all district in the United States. And very briefly, in some of the other political systems, particularly in parliamentary systems, more common in Europe, you have a form of proportional representation. And that the short version, again, this is oversimplified, but if you win 20% of the vote, you may get 20% of the seats. Again, it's not always like that, but generally speaking. With us, you must win the majority in the individual district. So what are the implications of that? Well, to understand how that makes it hard is, let's say if Mr. Trump starts a Patriot Party and whatever he wants to call it, and he runs congressional candidates in certain targeted districts, and the party can win. Let's say they win 17 votes or districts or 30 or whatever it might be. It seems pretty good for a new party. The reality is, though, given what is likely to happen there, they're probably going to be taking away seats from Republicans, that is, other Republicans, let's say. And the net effect is that it's going to simply give the Democrats probably more power in that situation. Maybe to put it another way, is it's very difficult to get national appeal that's going to take you beyond a few small numbers. And at the end of the day, that's why the two parties that we have that have been around since the mid-19th century, the same two, they basically control and dominate the space. It's just not easy to organize candidates and to have a system that's going to support them. And it's because of the electoral rules of the winner-take-all single-member districts. Other systems decide to do it differently. And again, they have formulas that might, some of them are determined by district, but some percentage might be done by proportional representation. And that lends itself to smaller parties. Now, more parties is not necessarily always good or easier, but it simply changes the dynamics, for example.
Well, you say been around since the 19th century, but what's interesting is that the nomenclature has remained the same, but the internal platforms of both parties have changed dramatically in the past 170 years since the Civil War.
Sure.
And I mean, in the Civil War, Lincoln was running the Republican Party. It was his brand new party at the time. And it was the party favoring the Union and favoring the franchise for African Americans and all that. It's just completely 180 now if you look at the Republican Party.
Sure.
In fact, what's interesting is they don't have a platform.
Well, I was just going to say, if you look at the Republican Party 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was the party of strong defense, free trade, limited government. Trump kind of turned a few of those around. I mean, not that he's not strong defense, but for example, trade, he suddenly turned it into, using trade more as a tool, increasing, tariffs and using the pressure on others. Spending, there wasn't a lot of fiscal conservatism, which is traditional. So I see your main point is that, yeah, the parties have evolved and changed. And many, as you know, we go through periods every few decades where the parties may shift significantly. And for the Republican Party, we often talk about the Reagan period where he brought in a large shift away from the traditional support for Democrats, especially in the South. So the old sort of Dixiecrats, as they might be called, conservative socially, but basically, well, anyway, I'm trying to garble my thoughts here, but in general, what we saw is a realignment of the Republican Party that took on a lot of what used to be traditional Democrat voters, particularly working class, sort of in a lot of the industrial belt. And so that changed the party dramatically. Also, the South converted to become the main base of the Republican Party. I think the challenge we see today is that what are the possible scenarios? Could it go towards some more moderate solution, becoming a minority party, as is the case in a lot of other systems, or could it somehow collapse inside? And maybe the reason we're talking about this is that we're seeing a bit of a civil war, a bit of a conflict right now between different camps, those that are pulled under Trump and a few small who are trying to pull it away and become more of a, I don't know, principled conservatives, or to try to do away with Trump's influence, right? And the best example, I think it was it yesterday? Or maybe it was this morning, I'm a little bit lost, but basically there was a press conference where the majority leader in the House basically was asked about Trump coming to this CPAC conference over the weekend and whether he should be there. What's his name? Kevin McCarthy. Quick answer.
Make it minority.
The minority, yeah, leader. His quick answer was yes. Standing right behind him was Liz Cheney, the part of the leadership. And she not only went in to say that something like, well, it's up to CPAC, she went on to add, basically, she doesn't think Trump has a place in the future of the party. And so that's a very awkward moment there for them to say in a press conference, but it shows you that you've got some divisions that are there. Now, it could go different ways and it remains to be seen, but back to your main point, how is it that Trump has such a hold on the party? There's no single easy answer. On one hand, it is a fear because he has the capacity to sort of anoint or support those who are going to be more supportive of him,
or
punish those who choose to go against him. And we've seen that already play out in a number of examples where he has taken a pretty tough position of supporting, some candidates and going against others. I mean, look at Jeff Sessions, who tried to run for the Senate again, and obviously he was going against a pro-Trump candidate. And despite his effort to paint himself as a Trumpster, the president very quickly just, managed to put him out. Quite interesting.
What is interesting, I know as a political scientist, I'd be interested in your thoughts as a political scientist on this. So you have a community, a small community, and there's a Republican Party, Democratic Party, and generation of people after generation, they're pretty much the same. They stay. The backbone okay, of these groups of people in small towns or neighborhoods, what have you, in districts, they stay. And if you visited a meeting of the Republican Party, in a given community this year, or rather say 1980, and then 10 years later, you find that the management is pretty much the same, even if the platforms have changed. Same thing with the Democrats. And I suspect that's not really what's happening now. I suspect that the standard managers, the standard, multi-generational groups that form up the party infrastructure are changing. It's, for example, attracting more conservative people and kicking out more liberal people. I mean, it evolves. And so if you say, well, the Republican Party been around, well, it's probably way different now than it was 10 years ago, even in the time of W. And I don't know about the Democratic Party. I think they're more consistent, my observation. But I think the animal to watch is the Republican Party, because it has drawn in all these conservative and right-wing and alt-right-wing people who Trump has, encouraged, and that's different, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, we're living in an era now where we have so much polarization that we speak of often, and maybe even this new challenge that we often call it a post-truth politics, right? Or what is the truth? I mean, the fact that you have a majority of registered Republicans who still believe the election was not fair, that it was stolen. I mean, how do you tackle that? How do you address that? Let me also add this, that the Republican Party, I mean, we've seen it now over the last few decades, it has effectively been a minority party. It has not gained a majority of the popular vote in presidential elections in most of the last, I think, 5 of the last 7. And so the last 2 that it won, it won without majorities. Now, that just speaks to the curious institutional features of our system, that you can get to power and not have that majority of the popular vote. It's not uncommon, I mean, in a different way, though, in many of the parliamentary systems, you often have a political party, it may be a very large party, but it doesn't have a majority. It has to come together with some smaller partners, typically in a coalition. Even an example might be Angela Merkel. She's part of the Christian Democrats in Germany. They are one of the bigger blocs, but they do not have a majority. Now, their system has small parties because of the proportional representation. But let me suggest that for the U.S., one scenario might be, we have today a very small group of moderate Republicans, and I'm speaking here of the Mitt Romney, Susan Collins, the Lisa Murkowskis of the world, and these are maybe described as some of the principled Republicans. They could have an interesting role in the near term here as kingmakers in some way, because if they were to get a caucus, enough of them, perhaps a growing caucus, they could find themselves negotiating directly with Democrats in a way that the other part of the party just keeps lurching to the far right and pro-Trump. They don't seem to be interested in negotiating, dialogue, compromise, the old bipartisanship.
But it's short-lived, isn't it? In other words, if they do that and sort of break away within the context of congressional legislation, negotiation, what have you, next time they come up for election, Trump or his friends are going to try to punish them. They're going to primary them. They're going to give money to the adversary. They're going to do everything they can, and like Jeff Sessions, get him out of office. Get him out of office and get a Trumper in there, or a more conservative person. And that's why you have to give real credit to Murkowski and Collins for breaking away from the hardline Trumpers. What I'm concerned about is that we're involved in a process where Trump ultimately gains, like a snowball. He gains more and more, traction as it goes down the hill. And here we are, and I really want to discuss this with you. Here we are with the CPAC thing. And the CPAC is happening now through Sunday. And on Sunday, Trump makes a big speech, and he probably packs the house with Trump supporters, and they yell and scream and flags with his name on it and everything. And it looks like a rally, sounds like a rally. It is criticism, it is divisive, but there is no positive platform for helping the country. There never has been, really, with him. All he wants to do is call names and everything. By the way, before we talk further about CPAC, I'd like to bring in our expert on CPAC. Okay, Alexa, What is CPAC?
The Conservative Political Action Conference, also known as CPAC, is an annual political conference hosted by the American Conservative Union that brings together American conservative activists and political officials.
There you have it. Nice to have a resource like that. So, what is going to happen at CPAC? Is CPAC a seminal event, a tipping point of some kind?
It's hard to say. Certainly right now, because of this crisis in the party, because of this, civil war, if we want to call it that, or this division, the spotlight is on it. What's going to happen? And now this is the first time since, post January 6th insurrection that Trump is going to now come and make an appearance. And obviously, I haven't even seen the details. I imagine he's going to be virtual, or is he going to be there live? I don't even know. But
I don't know either.
Whatever it is, I mean, he's going to make an appearance, and I think what we're seeing too is that, and I mentioned earlier, these moderate members as a potential scenario where they could be deal makers, maybe not. But the reality is that those same individuals are also further radicalizing the party even more. In other words, many people are seeing them as a betrayal, even a persecution of them in ways that makes them unelectable. It's getting pretty ugly, and it's likely to see more of that happening. I can imagine a tough dilemma for some of those. You mentioned Liz Cheney and even others. This other young guy, I can't remember his name right now, that escapes me, in the House, Michigan congressman who was one of the early ones to protest Trump. And his whole family is now disowning him, sending him letters of, what's his name, Ratzinger or Ketzinger or something? I'm sorry.
Itzlinger or something like that.
Yeah, I can't remember his name, but he's a young Republican congressman from Michigan, who's facing just a terrible backlash. So, well, there's part of that. But interesting that I think the party is going to have to figure out what it's going to do. Is it going to see itself being radicalized by these, the sort of conspiracy theory, radioactive types? That are going to keep, and they can certainly keep winning the very red districts. There's no doubt about that. But it's going to be a challenge as they kind of lurch the party farther away, because that, I don't know, my gut feeling is I don't see that expanding the base anymore. It's more, keeping it and holding it, but gradually losing some of the more professional, some of the suburban moms, places where suddenly, areas that are not so red are going to begin to change, and I think that doesn't bode well for the future of the party. So I think we're going to see this play out in ways that might not be very pretty. And at this point right now, the ones who dominate the party clearly are the Trump faction and the president.
What about McConnell? McConnell controls a lot of Republicans in Congress.
No, that's right.
McConnell doesn't like Trump, and Trump doesn't like McConnell. That's not to say that they couldn't find another unholy alliance.
That's
that
right.
Seems to happen around Trump.
Sure.
But the bottom line is they're trying to get money. Each one of them is trying to get money from the same people. They want money from corporate America. McConnell wants it. Trump wants it. McConnell wants it for his Republican Party. Trump wants it for his Republican Party. It's a battle royal. How does McConnell play in CPAC? How does McConnell play? Does McConnell win the battle for the hearts and minds of the red states?
Gosh, that's a tough one. McConnell, clearly we know that he is all about power and keeping it and winning elections and whatever it takes. He's a political animal in that respect. And yet he's carved out this interesting, trying to carve a little distance from Trump, and has taken, to criticizing him, probably trying to see if he can't be, I'm guessing here, thinking out loud, that maybe he's trying to be the leader of this evolving moderate faction. But he hasn't been very clear about that. I think he's sending mixed signals in that respect, almost like saying what he needs to so that it criticizes enough, but not going far enough. And I mean, look how it played out with the impeachment. Well, we don't want to impeach him while he's in office. He's out of office. Well, we can't impeach him because he's out of office. So you can't have it both ways, but he's trying. But it remains to be seen what his role is going to be, because in terms of controlling the agenda, he doesn't have the majority anymore in the Congress. He also doesn't have the full Republican support. We have this small number of the more moderates who are clearly defecting. So I think he's probably
Trump wants the others to defect from him, isn't it?
Oh
You
yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah.
so you have the moderates like Murkowski and others that we mentioned, the seven who voted for impeachment, and then of course you have the guys who follow McConnell. They have and they are now, but then you have the defections that are going to move in the direction of Trump, who is trying to recruit them. That's
Sure.
what he's trying to do, and punish everyone else. So
Yeah.
now you're going to have three groups. Am I right? Essentially,
Well,
three groups.
yeah, maybe these those ones you mentioned, the latter, the Trump Ultra. These are the hardline, pro-Trumpsters. It's today it's led by Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz. We would probably throw in Rick Scott, the other senator from Florida, and even the Florida governor, who's kind of also trying to rise rapidly as a national star in the party. So definitely a fair number of them, and there are others to follow right behind them. Tom Cotton from Arkansas, he's a leading voice as well of this hard right, very strong critic of China as well. You've got Marco Rubio, who's in some ways trying to carve out a niche for himself as a consistent anti-Trump Republican, but he's himself been frequently attacked by the president and president's critics as well. So he's kind of in a bit of a mushy area in the middle there. Then you have the other rising star, if we call it that, the former UN ambassador, South
Nikki
Carolina
Haley. Yeah.
Governor Nikki Haley, and she's recently stepped out of the full, leaving the Trump lane, and she's been more critical of her one-time boss, and that prompted a snubbing by the former president when she requested an audience in Mar-a-Lago, and he said nope. So interesting. But it is astonishing. Here we are, literally 5-6 weeks after the dramatic insurrection and the subsequent impeachment again, and now we're talking about Donald Trump possibly as the leading candidate for 2024 today, right now. He still has the control of the party and the support of the base. So as we speak today, and as he speaks to the CPAC over the weekend, he is still the leader of the Republican Party.
And I mean, in terms of personality and cult, Romney can't hold a candle, I'm afraid. And of course, McConnell may be looking for someone else, but there's no one else who appears. And I don't think McConnell himself would run for president. So you have nobody else in the room essentially, and it's that personality and cult thing that attracts people to him. So short of some remarkable events that might take place between now and 2024, or whenever the presidential campaign really starts. Some say it's starting right now at CPAC. This is the beginning of it. Historically, it has been. Short of some remarkable events, Trump really does have a pretty good chance of being the candidate for a large part of the Republican Party that he can bring together. The question really is, will other things pull the rug out from under him? For example, when Nancy Pelosi gets her insurrection commission together, they might find that Trump is more involved than we have known, that the impeachment evidence didn't go far enough. In fact, he really created the whole thing. Query whether that could affect things. And then, of course, you have these lawsuits, both civil and criminal, for what he has done, and you have these what do you call it, legacy sabotage points coming out, where he was sabotaging the government over a period of time, and I think some of that will come out. So he's going to get lambasted one way or the other, civil, criminal, and in the press over the next, I don't know, year or so. And query, do you think that can stop his railroad?
Well, of course it could, and especially if it's something very serious that leads to any criminal culpability and the like. And yet, having said that, look, this guy has managed to somehow survive things that would have put anyone out on any given day. So I'm reluctant to say that there's no possibility he could come back. Maybe I may wish that or have a personal preference, but no, at the end of the day, anything could happen. And even I go back to this idea that I think it's fair to say that the Republican Party is probably likely to continue as a minority party in the near future, maybe even longer term. And one scenario would be to figure out, as other minority parties do, how can you make the best of that, work within that. Ultimately, it's going to be a pull between those that are lurching to the far right, the conspiracy, the Trumpsters, the deniers, and they are not keen on cooperation, bipartisanship, anything like that. So they're just going to be disrupting, basically creating, chaos and the like. And there are going to be many others. I think today it's a small part of the party, but maybe that could expand, that are going to say, no, the future of the party needs to be reclaiming its roots, its ideological, platform, which today doesn't quite exist. And indeed, what was this last election about? It wasn't about what he's going to do. It was more like, scaring you about what the others are going to do, but it wasn't based on any specific policy platform, right? In other words, you vote for me and this is what you get. That was absent from this last election. It was all about the personality and maybe the fear of the alternative.
Yeah.
So
you mentioned the far right, the skinheads, call them for short, who have assault weapons, who don't mind using them, who just love a good fight, and they're the ones who do violence and so forth. Come to find, by the way, there was an article recently about how only a small percentage of the people who invaded the Capitol were them. And the much larger percent were the ordinary middle-class peoples, people, the firemen, the policemen,
angry,
the small business owners, who just didn't feel they had a good deal and they were afraid, from a racial point of view, probably, that, somebody was going to replace them and their lives would be less attractive. But what happens to them? What happens to them in the new Republican Party that we're talking about? The moderate Republican Party. What happens to them? Do they not join? Do they go back home and fondle their assault rifles and have a little shootout once in a while? What happens to them?
Yeah, no, it's hard to say, but I think, and let me just mention the new term that we need to, or that we're hearing used more, is domestic violent extremists. And I think what you're referring to, some of these radicalized elements, obviously, they're organized. It's this white nationalism, taken to an extreme level. And it's important to underscore this. Not all Republicans are right, are these far right violent extremists. Of course not, or even racist, although, people can debate that. But at the end of the day, this is a group that today is the largest threat to the U.S., more than foreign terrorists, more than invading immigrants coming, to take your jobs. It is these radicalized groups, and they have been given, of course, sort of a voice and maybe a platform under Trump, and they continue to have that. But I would say at the end of the day, I think the Republican Party has to decide whether they are going to remain, sort of the party that's dominated by this white nationalist party, or are they going to move to eventually snip those out of it? It's going to be a challenge. I don't see it finishing anytime soon. I think it's going to be a battle for the soul of the party over these next couple of years, and it could go either way. It could find itself captured by Trump and the Trump, followers, or it could find itself imploding and dividing even more. It's not likely to be a pretty picture.
Yeah, and the big contention is corporate America. That's where the money is. The money doesn't come from the guys with the assault rifles. It comes from corporate America. Corporate America may not like the idea of having another insurrection. They may not want to be under the same tent. So this is really interesting going forward. So here's a big question for you, and I guess it must be my final question. I make you for a moment, Carlos. I make you Joe Biden. I make you Joe Biden's administration. And we know they're out there. We know they're just, they hate Joe Biden. They hate Joe Biden and everything he stands for. They hate his kindness. Okay. How does he deal with them without further, radicalizing them? Does he come down on them? Does he, not that he has all that much control of Merrick Garland, but does he try to prosecute them and stop them in the streets? Does he bring out the National Guard on them? What does he do to what do you want to call it, civilize them?
Yeah, well, I think you've hit it on squarely in that there's no simple and easy answer. And I could see a various pronged approach. And what I'm thinking real quickly is, I think Biden, because he is a longtime senator, he knows some of those in the Congress, particularly the Senate, on a very personal level. My hunch is that he's going to probably try to reach out to some of those. But we've already seen by now evidence that he has decided if they're not going to be there to cooperate, we're going to have to go it alone. And I think we're going to see a lot of that, where at this point, the tradition of bipartisanship where you had Republican support, even if it was on the margins. I don't think they're going to be waiting around for that. I think we're already seeing signs that they're ready to move forward, given the majority in the House and the control of the Senate, to simply work without Republicans. And if a few of them want to join, great. And maybe that, there'll be criticism, oh, well, that's not being, bipartisan, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we don't see a lot of cooperation coming from outside of the 2 or 3 that we've mentioned who are, even it was quite remarkable to see that group visit the White House and come to, make this Republican, the moderates who went and presented their proposal. It was opening a dialogue on one hand, but of course you can see others in the party seeing them as basically, against everything that they and not supporting that.
Inconsequential, therefore inconsequential. Yeah.
Sure. At the end of the day. So, boy, what is Biden going to do? I think my guess is that he's going to put his energies on just delivering the goods in terms of focusing on public policy. If he's not going to have Republicans on board, then just deal with it without them as it moves forward, and hope that the outcome, that the deliverables are going to help gain support, to stay in power and continue that way. Other than that, I don't think it's going to be up to Biden to determine the future of the party. That has to come from the Republicans themselves, and that remains to be seen if it's going to be anytime soon, or whether we're going to lurch our way up to 2024 with Trump still a factor. Who knows? I mean, many things could happen in the next year or two, as you hinted, but we just don't know. At the same time, Trump could survive them all, as he has so many other times.
Yeah, I wonder if he can run for president in a jumpsuit. But one more thing, if you don't mind, Carlos.
No. Yeah.
So Biden is, he's elderly already, and he may not last a term. he may not have the strength for one reason or another. He may not be able to continue through his 4-year term right now, and that makes Kamala Harris, the president. And she's half Black, she's half Indian. It's a combination that the racists don't like too much. And if they gave Obama a hard time, they're certainly going to give her a hard time. How does that change the calculation on things? She becomes the president. She wants to push through an agenda, like Biden, or maybe the more progressive members in the Democratic Party, which has its own internal problems these days.
Sure.
Where does that go? Are we in better shape, worse shape? My guess is that the Republicans, such as they are, with or without Trump, are going to react against her on a racist basis. What happens?
Yeah, no, that it could go different ways. It could be an ugly scenario, of course. Much depends maybe on how the transition happens, who becomes her vice president, if that's the case. And how much is she pulled towards the more, either more leftist or progressive or whatever we want to call it, because there's always going to be those pressures there, of course. Boy, it's just too hard to speculate, but definitely at a minimum, it would mobilize a lot of the Trump supporters to, radicalize and complain more. But part of me wants to think that just as we look at dealing with violent extremists, and I'm talking more about the small margin that are these radicalized ones, just like when we confront terrorists, in the global arena, often you have to figure out how to marginalize, just the leaders of that, and how to kind of push them to the margins so that others realize it's not in their interest to do so. In other words, what I'm getting at here is that until the day comes when the Republican Party and a growing majority of them realize that their future is not becoming a white nationalist racist party, but instead moving back to their principled conservative, because I would argue that the United States and most political systems do need to have a minority or opposition party. They need something on the left, something on the right, so they can, in a democracy at least, work more effectively. And those that don't have that have suffered more. So there is a role and a place for even a minority opposition party that can still shape the agenda and so on. Today, we don't see that, and I don't see it happening too soon. So I think the party is going to find itself in this internal civil war until something dramatic happens. Either Trump disappears from the scene, or does he come back? And anybody's guess.
Anybody's guess, but when you say that, when you say anybody's guess, and we don't know for sure, we can't tell, what that means, Carlos, is that we have to watch this ever more carefully
Sure. Yeah.
every day, every hour,
Yep.
and
Yep.
certainly every show. We're out of time for now, but I would like to revisit all these same points next time we meet.
Absolutely. No, it's always great to connect, and thank you for a chance to speculate on this again. So many unknowns, but certainly that the future is going to be interesting as we see it unfold. Let's hope it doesn't get worse. Let's hope things can shape to get better, and who knows. But thank you, as always, Jay, a chance to reconnect and talk story.
Thank you, Carlos. Aloha.
Aloha.
Take care.